Hello and welcome to a whole bunch of more information on congressional debate. This video is going to be all about speeches. So as soon as my screen is shared, go ahead and get started. Once again, everything speeches. This video is going to be going over cycles, overarching debate structure, just talking about how a debate actually works together, speech types and positions, basic speech structure, contention structure, flowing the debate, and delivery. So we're going to start off with cycles and structure of an ideal debate. It says ideal because this almost never happens. A lot of the time in local tournaments, you're going to see a whole bunch of people giving up the opportunity to do refutation in lieu of giving a contention that was pre-prepared. So it's not uncommon to have like fourth, fifth cycle constructive speeches that are solely constructive. So like an introduction, 3 constructive contentions, and a conclusion, pre-prepared, no refutation, but that's not what you're trying to do. The idea within Congress is that the affirmation and the negation introduce the world in the first cycle that they are advocating for, either passing or failing the legislation. And then as the debate evolves, there's going to be less and less pre-prepared contentions and more refutation, more weighing, more crystallization, and it goes down the flow. So each pair of speeches, one affirmation, one negation, is called a cycle. As the cycles advance down the flow, speeches take on different functions. So like I was saying, those original ones are setting up the world and then refuting, extending, all of that kind of stuff. Cycles can be broken when there's an uneven debate, but frowned on and manageable by the PO. So say that you're in a chamber of 10 people and 8 of you want to speak on the affirmation. It's not uncommon for there to be affirmation, negation, affirmation, negation, affirmation, and then you don't have a third negation. So the PO, the presiding officer, might break cycle and say, when they're calling for a negation, as the chair recognizes no speakers on the negation, we'll now break cycle and move to speeches on the affirmation, although it is highly frowned on, this is going to continue debate. So they're just saying that you need to continue debate, and even though there isn't a negation speech, there needs to be the next one given, and it's going to be an affirmation. For more experienced POs, they may be encouraging the chamber to write negation speeches and have some people flip from the affirmation to the negation so that it's not 8 on the aff, 2 on the neg, and everyone is just kind of upset and the judges have heard the same speech 5 times in a row by the end. It's not nice. So try to have as even as a debate as possible. As a member, you should be trying to even it out as well. Some tournaments have rules surrounding the number of times a cycle can be broken, typically 3 consecutive speeches on one side before it's forced question. So that's a motion to move previous question, which triggers the end of the debate and voting. Speakers will typically speak once on each legislative item. Sometimes you'll hear people speak more than once. Generally, that's not a good strategy. That being said, there is something to be said about playing with speeches with amendments. There was this move that I used to do where I would give a speech on like the first 2 cycle negations, and I would introduce this huge issue within the legislation that if solved, I would be willing to affirm. And then I would propose an amendment after the questioning period was fulfilled. That amendment would usually not be debated, but generally passed. They were always germane. And then later I would give an aff crystallization, not only refuting myself on the negation earlier on the flow, but also going through the rest of the negative responses and the affirmation. And it's a strong move. So you can speak twice on a bill, but make sure that it's purposefully. Don't just speak twice to fill time. If absolutely no one is speaking on something and you need to have a speech be given on one side or the other, yes, sure, for the sake of debate, introduce something, but please introduce new points, introduce new refutation, introduce new information. Don't just give the same speech that you already gave, but like 10 minutes later. It doesn't really help anyone. So this is a visual for how the constructive, refutation, weighing, and crystallization are going to move through the round. So in A1N1, that's your first cycle, first affirmative, first negative, it should be mainly constructive. That's going to be like a pre-prepared sponsorship, authorship, first negation. In that second cycle, A2N2, you're going to have constructive with a little bit of refutation. Sometimes you'll also see refutation in that first negation. A really fun speech structure that it's difficult to pull off well, but a lot of fun to see, is when an author or a sponsor introduce the legislation, paint the world as this rosy picture, and then the negation, instead of going up and giving a constructive, goes and just rips apart that first speech for like the first 2 minutes of what they're doing, and then give a constructive contention or do weighing and explain how the legislation is non-solvent or whatever it may be. So that first negation has a little bit of room to play, but that first affirmation, always constructive. Moving on to that second cycle, a little bit more refutation being built in. Third cycle, more refutation, now some weighing. So saying the affirmation world's impacts compared to the negative negations world's impacts. In that fourth cycle, you might have a little bit of constructive, and then mostly refutation, a bit more weighing. And then in those last cycles, whatever the last cycle is, so if there are 10 people in your chamber, like this chamber, then that's cycle 5, A5, N5. If there are 12 people, it'll be 6. If there are 20, it would be 10, but I really recommend that you don't speak all the way to that 10th cycle because it's going to be really difficult to have nuance points past anything 6, 7. But the last speech on both sides is called crystallization. The crystallization speech has a very specific function. They are specifically looking at what has been happening down the flow of debate, which contentions have brought up the most refutation, what's been ping-ponging back and forth. And their job is to explain why the judges or the representatives vote in their side. So if I'm giving an affirmation crystallization, I explain everything that has happened on the flow, or at least the main 2-3 themes, and then explain why the affirmations world is favorable over the negations. The negation crystal does the exact same thing. They look at all of the content, go through, name drop whoever it was who brought up the certain contentions, and then explain why the legislation should fail. Speech functions. You heard a couple of these words. Constructive, those are the ones that are given early in the round, used to flesh the affirmative and the negative worlds. Remember, the world is just, if we pass this legislation, this is what the world looks like, as opposed to the status quo. The status quo is whatever is currently happening. So that's what we're living in right now. We're living in the status quo. So if you affirm legislation, here's what happens. If you negate legislation, here's what happens. Constructives also establish or extend an argument on the speaker's side of the debate. So if I am giving the second affirmation and I pre-wrote my contentions, but they're really similar to what the first affirmation was talking about, instead of word for word rephrasing what they said with the same impact, same data, same whatever, you instead can use the same claim, same tag. So say let's use an actual example. Let's say that we're talking about a plastic bag tax, and the affirmation is making environmental claims saying that it's going to protect marine wildlife. Then the second affirmation could still do an environmental contention, but say instead of marine wildlife, that it is stopping microplastics from leaching into groundwater and polluting individuals, people's constituents. So same idea, both environmental contentions, but their impact is different. Second, refutation. They refute an established contention or an extension on the opposing side of the debate. So say that marine wildlife plastic bag contention was given by the first affirmation, then someone on the negation might say, well, actually, it's not plastic bags that do the majority of marine pollution, it's actually industrial fishing. And if we were to pass this legislation, the impact on marine wildlife would be so incredibly small, but we would be putting a band-aid on a bullet wound, giving ourselves a pat on the back for half-thought legislation. And instead, we should fail this legislation, allow consumers to continue using these plastic bags, and focus instead on industrial fishing if that is what the affirmation is trying to help, if that's what they're trying to benefit. So it's kind of weighing different points, weighing different solutions, talking through different ideas that could go on either side, whether you pass or fail the legislation, again, based around that status quo. Refutation also weighs the impacts and arguments across the flow. So remember, the flow is the debate. And then they're often paired with a constructive contention or extension of an existing argument. So it's the way that you put different speech contentions together, you kind of link them throughout a speech. So you usually have an introduction and then 2 or 3 contentions and then a conclusion. In a constructive speech, that's going to be introduction, positive contention, positive contention, positive contention, all of them constructing something. So constructive, constructive, constructive. In a refutation speech, you might be doing a single constructive that has a really, really, really nuanced argument or an impact that hasn't been brought up yet, and then spend the rest of your time refuting arguments that have already been brought up. You can do that within a contention structure. So you can say, Representative McIntyre on the affirmation brought up this, and I am going to explain why they're wrong with this source, claim, data, impact, all that kind of stuff. Alternatively, you can do non-solvency. You can stray from a refutational structure within a contention and just go through and say, this person said this, but I say that, this person said this, but I said that, and just go down the flow like that. But a refutation speech really is just going against what has been established, trying to break down those constructive contentions. Crystallization, I already explained a little bit, but it weighs the overarching issues present throughout the debate, and it should focus on the largest areas of contention, weigh in favor of the speaker's own side of the debate, and should mention by name those who introduced the arguments originally. So Representative Mongolic on the affirmation brought up that plastic point. I am in the crystallization going to talk about environment, but not only am I going to talk about Mongolics, I'm also going to talk about Marotras on the second affirmation. I don't know whether I should be using names that exist, but these are all people I respect. So I hope that it is an okay thing. I can't make them all Smith. That is mine. I apologize. So Mongolic brought up the plastic bag, marine. Marotra brought up environment, plastic bag, and microplastics. So then on the crystallization, either on the affirmation or negation, I should be weighing the environmental impacts of the legislation, mentioning both Mongolic and Marotra as long as what they said is relevant to how I am weighing and constructing the contention within the crystal. So yeah, what types of speeches exist? So those were like the different functions of speeches, but what types actually exist? I'm gonna switch. No, okay. So these are all the different types that you could see. These are the common ones. Morning hour, constructive, authorship, first negation, amendment speech, housekeeping, sponsorship, nomination speech, refutation, final appeal, crystallization. And just like you guys saw earlier, some of these have the same function or go in the same place, but are called different things. Let me just go through and explain. Nomination speech and housekeeping speeches are both given by the presiding officer. This is the only speech that the presiding officer, these two are the only speeches that the presiding officer will give during the round. That nomination speech happens before they are elected, after they have been nominated by another representative within the chamber. The housekeeping speech happens after they have assumed the position of the chair. So they have been elected by the majority of those present in the chamber, and they now need to explain all of the policies and decorum that are going to go over the round. So that's time signals, how to do an amendment, how to talk if something comes up in the chamber, how to do a point of personal privilege if you wish to leave, when the recesses are, when the end of the session is, all that kind of stuff is going in the housekeeping speech. Authorship and sponsorship both take that first affirmative spot on the flow, but they serve slightly different functions. The authorship is given and delivered by the person who wrote the legislation or someone from the person who wrote the legislation school. So it's a reserved spot. Remember that if you give an authorship, you're able to jump precedence and recency. That doesn't exist for any other speech. So if you have that author written on the bottom of the legislation, Representative Alexandra Smith wrote this bill, then I would get the opportunity to introduce the legislation to the chamber, and the PO calls specifically for the author before they call for anyone else. If no author is present, the presiding officer is then going to call for a sponsorship. The sponsorship, again, takes that first affirmative spot on the flow, but is a little bit different function than the authorship. If I'm the sponsor, I did not write the legislation, and I am not saying that it's perfect. The author is saying, I wrote this legislation, I will die on this hill. The sponsor is saying, I wish I wrote this legislation, and it's pretty darn good, and I support its passage more than anyone else here. That doesn't mean that the sponsor can't critique the legislation. It is a bit counterintuitive for an author to critique the legislation. If you're introducing a bill to the floor that you are claiming that you wrote and then pointing out the issues within it, that's probably not the strongest position for you to take. The sponsor has a little bit more wiggle room to do so and can propose amendments, can do anything like that if they deem that necessary, essentially. Next is that first negation. The first negation is based solely off precedence and recency, just like that sponsorship. And it's just the first negative speech on the legislation, introducing the negations world. Next, constructive and refutation. We talked a little bit about those in the last one. Constructive speeches are early in the cycles. So A2, N2, A3, N3, those may be constructive still. And they start to have more and more refutation built into them. Once the majority of the speech is refutation, like by time or by quantity, whatever you want to characterize it with, then it's considered a refutation speech. And that refutation primarily is trying to break down constructive contentions. Next, refutation crystallization. Remember that refutation is both paired with constructive and can be paired with the weighing aspects of a crystallization. So it's kind of a weird function, but they're essential within Congress. You need to debate what's actually been established in order for the debate to continue. So that refutation we've already talked about. And then crystallization is the last speech on both sides that goes over the main themes of the debate and is talking to the members of the chamber on the voters. So the main themes that will cause an affirmative or a negative ballot. Okay, just all that stuff again. This is what you're going to see in every chamber. Notice that not every speech from the last page is here. I'll explain those in a second, but these are the ones that you're going to see in any typical chamber. So the nomination speech given by the PO before voting, housekeeping given by the elected PO going over session procedure, authorship reserved for the author, has 2 minutes of questioning at the end because it's a first cycle speech. Sponsorship, remember, is only given if the author is not present. If you have an author present and they give that A1 speech, the A2 is then just the second affirmative. It is not the sponsor, it's the second affirmative. You also, when calling, don't call for a first affirmative if no one stands for a sponsorship. It needs to have a sponsor. You need a sponsor of the legislation. So chambers get in a bit of a sticky spot when the agenda has been set and they're calling for a sponsor and no one is standing, no one is recognizing, because then you're kind of forced to take a recess, and that it sucks to have to do that. You look really unprepared and unprofessional. So that's part of the reason that we always write 5 contentions on every bill so that you know how to put together a speech. First negation is delivered by the first negative speaker and has 2 minutes of questioning, typically constructive. Remember, it can jump around a little bit with that structure. And then constructive speeches are everything past that first cycle. The first are also constructive, they're just special. And they establish contentions in the early cycles of debate, 1 minute of questioning as they are past the first cycle. Refutations refute established contentions, 1 minute of questioning, and then crystallizations cover the common points throughout the debate and introduce a whole bunch of weighing, also 1 minute of questioning. Now we're gonna get into the weird ones. Morning hour speeches. Chances are you won't see one, but they are becoming more common with online debates. They are becoming more common on the national circuit. So they might start getting introduced at local circuits. You may as well note it is. A morning hour is a speech where you introduce an issue that exists within the status quo, explain the scope of it, and then tell the chamber what's exactly happening, how big this issue is, why you should care, and what a possible solution is. It's typically a 3-minute speech. Sometimes tournaments will allow 4 minutes. There's typically 1 minute of questioning. Sometimes tournaments will allow 2 minutes. Just read the rules. They're a little bit new. They're a little bit odd. People are still getting used to them. They were used as a tech check at a tournament I was at. You weren't actually scored on it, but it was just like a make sure your camera's working, first session, make sure everyone has gotten to the tournament okay. I don't love that because it's a speech that you need to write beforehand on a topic of your choosing that you need to be well prepared enough to be able to stand for 2-ish minutes of questioning on. But they're not a waste of time. They are really helpful for constructing a speech that you really can get into because it's on a topic of your choosing. So have some fun with those. Next is a final appeal. These also are becoming more common. These also are more common to the national circuit, but might be going to local circuits. So final appeals are these 90-second speeches given by the first affirmative speaker on any piece of legislation after the motion to move previous question has happened. So once the debate has been exhausted or the time limit has been reached, presiding officer or a member of the chamber will motion to move previous question. Once that motion is passed with 2/3 majority, then the sponsor author will do a final appeal. So they take the floor and they have a last chance to basically have the final word. There's no questioning on final appeals. It really is just 90 seconds. All right, guys, this is what's happened since I first introduced the legislation. This is why we still pass. Affirm. And that's what it is. An amendment speech, don't give one if you can avoid it. Amendments aren't common in Congress. I think they should be. I think they're a ton of fun and add a whole nother layer to the debate. For those of you who aren't familiar, if you, I don't even know of any chambers that have recordings of amendments passing, but an amendment is proposed by a member of the chamber during session to amend the legislation. It's literally changing some aspect of the legislation. It can be ruled dilatory or germane by the chair and parley, so they can say, this is dilatory, it changes the intention of the legislation and it is not sustained, or they can entertain it and call it germane and say, all right, the amendment proposed has been deemed germane, and then someone on the floor will make a motion to amend. 1/3 of the chamber will agree to that and with a second, and then the floor is open for debate on the amendment, and it's just this whole process that changes the debate mid-round, which can be a lot of fun and cause a lot of mischief and shake up the chamber in a way that's unique to amendments. But during amendment procedure, there's a time when the floor is open for speeches on the amendment. They are not in the affirmation or negation of an amendment, they're simply on it. If you did not propose the amendment, I highly recommend that you do not give an amendment speech, because you're going to have about 10 seconds to put together a 3-minute speech. Really hard to do, even harder to do well. If you did propose that amendment, in most cases, you probably don't need to explain it, especially if you gave a negation speech or gave an affirmation speech and talked within a contention about what in the bill needs to be changed, and then went over it during a recess time, blah, 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 let the chair know you're going to make an amendment. They usually pass without needing to give a speech on them if they're ruled germane. So just keep that all in mind. Quick little recap. If the page switches there. So these speeches are atypical, but may be encountered. You should be aware of them. Exactly what we we're just talking about. Morning hour, final appeal, amendment speech. If you see it in tournament rules, just be aware of how to do it. But you're not going to see it in a typical tournament, so don't worry too much. All right, how is the speech constructed? We're going to go over typical speech construction. So this is if you were to have a very, very basic constructive speech, this is what you do. You have an introduction. That goal is to capture the intention of the audience, establish the context within which the legislation is being proposed, and deliver a thesis. That thesis has contention tags. The contention tags are 1 to 3 words summarizing the claim being argued in the body of the speech. This is called signposting. So whenever in the speech you are giving those transition words, giving the indication that you are moving on to a next contention, giving a name to the contention before you've even delivered it, that's signposting. That tells your judge and the other members of your chamber exactly where you are in your speech, exactly what you're talking about, and exactly where you're going. It helps with organization. Don't forget the signpost and never forget a thesis. That gives framework for your argument. So it's saying exactly what's going to be laid out, in what order. Yeah. The body of the speech is where the bulk of the content is delivered. So after that thesis has been given, you get into the body. The majority of your sources and claims will be delivered within this body, and the space can be used for constructive arguments, extensions of arguments already presented, refutation of constructed arguments, or weighing of the impacts present prior to your speech in the round. A lot of words basically means the gist, the main idea, the body, the content of your speech is held within the body of it. It doesn't matter what form of speech you're giving, you should have a body. If you don't, you're doing something wrong. Even if you're giving a refutation speech, that's where the content is. That's where the sources are. If you're giving a crystallization speech, that's where the content is. That's where the sources are. If you're giving a dramatic interpretation of how the legislation makes you feel, I have seen, you might not have a body. But that's not Congress. That's not Congress. So make sure that you have content, body, claims, your arguments, essentially. The conclusion is the purpose. The conclusion is to remind the audience of the contentions or contention within your speech and to wrap it up in a way that's not abrupt. So you don't want to say, get to the end of your third contention and then just stop talking, because you've gone through 3 pieces of information, 3 contentions, and you should probably have like a cute wrap up in order to draw attention back to the introduction, whatever attention getting device you used, helpful to reference that. If you're using a certain narrative of rhetoric, then referencing back to that just to draw back the response from the audience, whatever that may be, you want to wrap it up in a way that's not abrupt. Ideally, that conclusion will link back to the introduction, and tags should be used here as well. So in the conclusion of your speech, you're going to be saying, representatives, we need to pass this legislation first for the environment, second for the government, third for the economy. And that's the conclusion. Then you've wrapped it up in the same order that your content was delivered. Speech timing, again, basic constructive. For the introduction, you should really not be taking more than 30 seconds. Usually you want to aim for the end of your thesis being delivered by that 30-second point. Then 40 seconds for each of your body points, contention, 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 and your conclusion should be about 20 seconds. This gives you 250. So you have a little bit of wiggle room. You want to aim for your speech to be right on the nose at 3 minutes. When you are in chamber, you're going to be getting time signals, 3 of them. The first one comes at 2 minutes. The second one comes at 2:30. The third comes at 2:55. At that third time mark, so either 3 gavel taps from the presiding officer or them holding up a card if you're online saying 2:55, you should really be on your last sentence. That should be the indication that wherever the sentence ends, you're done. So according to the NSDA rules, you do have a 10-second grace period though. That grace extends to 3:10. In the housekeeping speech, so that's that speech that the PO gives at the beginning of the session, they will say the extension of grace. Typically it is 3:10. Typically that is the point that you get cut off at. I've heard people extend all the way up to 3:20. Don't do it. You're eating up time of other speakers in the round and preventing them from giving the number of speeches that possibly is equitable or fair. So really try to end at 3 minutes rather, and at 3 minutes, 10 seconds, that you should be done. You should be cut off and you should not say any more words. So just be done at 3:10. Basic contention format. So you can definitely play around with the way that contentions work, but generally when you first learn them, this is the format that you're going to learn. Claim, warrant, data, impact. Your claim is the position or argument. The warrant is the reason that the claim is true, as well as how it links back to the legislation. The data is the evidence to support your claim. So that's wherever you're getting the information to back up what it is that you're arguing. And then the impact is why the truth of the claim matters. So the way that I explain this to the kiddos when I'm teaching is really, I need to tell you what it is I'm arguing, why this argument is valid, how I know that this argument is valid, and why you should care. So that claim is the position or argument, and then you need to really contextualize it, why it's true, why it's relevant, why it matters. The evidence is whatever information you're getting that from. So New York Times, Washington Post, government, some sort of something brief. And then impact is why you care, why you you is really vague here. It could be the judges, it could be your constituents, it could be 5 generations down the road. Just make sure that you are quantifying the scope of the argument, the scope of the impact, and saying how many people this affects and why it must be passed or failed now. The impact after you've delivered it, it's helpful to just do a little line of the second reason we affirm this legislation. Just to remind the judges the point that you're standing on and what all of this is leading to. So you're just, that's kind of like the clincher. All right, a tip: contention tags and signposting keep your speech organized. Use them, and the order of contention tags within your thesis should mirror the order of delivery. So if I'm saying environment, government, economy, I don't want to deliver my speech contentions in economy, environment, government, because that's different than what I just said, and the judge has already written down the 3 words that I've told them. So now when I'm jumping around, they're going to have to take time to reorient themselves, and it just works better when your thesis mirrors your body. Weighing. So I've mentioned a little bit about weighing. Weighing is really pinning one source against another, and it is especially important in refutation and crystallizations. Be sure to question the credibility and time frame of both sources, both being the one that you're refuting and the one that you are using to refute it. And you should be using the strongest information you can when creating contentions. So when you're putting together a speech, remember how we were talking about with research media bias? Don't want to buy a source, don't want an outdated source, don't want one lacking credibility, want an author who knows what they're talking about. You want an expert within their field. And if you are quoting a person within an article, make sure you explain how that person is relevant. So if I were to say Nancy Pelosi is a name that a lot of us are going to recognize, but maybe not everyone. You might be doing a quick Google search of who the heck Nancy Pelosi is right now. If I want to say she's an authority on some sort of matter, then I need to give her qualifications. I cannot just name drop and expect my audience to know who it is that I'm referring to and why they are reputable on whatever information I am asking them to explain. If someone is a firsthand witness to something and you're using them as an explanation of a narrative, or something that you hear very common is when talking about like minimum wage legislation or single parent legislation or welfare legislation, is someone will give an example of an individual who is currently facing some sort of economic issue as a result of not having enough resources made available to them, and will use their name and name drop them, but then forget to mention that this is a single mother trying to support 5 people. This is a man who has been on disability but hasn't been able to receive his checks because he doesn't have a permanent address. This is a person who has been seeking criminal justice for X case for Y amount of time and has been repeatedly ignored and held on probation for something. Make sure you quantify and explain and give the fullest picture of the person who you are using as an expert, because they need to have credibility. For Wayne, you really keep in mind that credibility and time frame. So when looking at credibility, when looking at building your own contentions, consider if the source is heavily biased, if the source is known for publishing unreliable information, whether or not studies are peer reviewed, if an article is an opinion article, is the author an expert, is the information from a government source? And then also consider time frame. So you want the sources to be as relevant and published as recently as possible. When was the information created that is being analyzed? Sometimes with the New York Times is pretty good about this, but they will sometimes like reference studies that were published years ago and then not immediately make it apparent that that study was from a certain year. So instead of saying like a 2017 study, they'll say a study published by blank person, and then like a couple paragraphs down say this 2017 study. 2017 was 5 years ago. I bet you that there is more relevant information, more recent information. Just look at the publication date as well as the date of the information and when it was created. And then also question whether anything has fundamentally changed since the publication date. So Ukraine has been a big topic lately. There's been some legislation on it. The week before Russia invaded, there was legislation, I can't remember exactly what tournament it was, speaking about whether or not the United States should take preemptive measures. And it was introduced to tournament in the docket like 15 days ahead of when the actual debate was going to happen. And I just kept telling my kids, okay, push it off, push it off, push it off. Don't debate this yet. Make sure that this is one of the last ones that you write your speech for. Yes, research it. Yes, get background information. Yes, figure out the context of the issue and have a broader understanding of what's going on. But don't write your opinion on this until like the day before, because there could be an invasion before that point. There could be something that fundamentally changes before the time that you're writing this. And then there was. So I didn't want to be right, but that is something to keep in mind. When world events are happening, make sure that the information put into your speech doesn't become outdated in the 2 weeks between when you wrote the speech and when you're delivering it. What should I be paying attention to when listening to the debate? Flowing. So flowing the debate is when you track the speakers of each cycle and the arguments that they have presented. You should be tracking the contention tags. So that's the 1 to 3 word little, this is what I'm arguing, the gist of the information and the source, if you can catch it. Even if you can just catch like Representative Malhotra, that New York Times source in your second contention. I don't necessarily need data publication, blah, 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 but I should be able to say something that rings a bell for them of what it is that I'm talking about. Whether they are responding to another argument. So if they're doing refutation, make sure that you have some sort of way of showing that this argument that they're presenting is directly refuting that one that was brought up earlier in the flow. And then the impact of their point on the respective world. So why you care, why it matters, what the larger impact and the scope of this contention is. For a tip, many find that flowing is easier to do on paper or post-it notes instead of a typed document. It allows you to draw arrows, write in margins, use different colored pens, highlight, connect points. I personally used post-it notes, and every person who gave a speech got their own post-it note. If they were on the affirmation, they got blue. If they were on the negation, they got red. And then I would write with a blue and red pen. And then anything responded to by a negation speaker would be written in blue for what it was that the affirmation had brought up. And then the response was written in red. And I just like, I played around with the colors to visually represent exactly what was happening down the flow. And that way it was really easy just to see, okay, first cycle, second cycle, third cycle, fourth cycle, because they'd be stuck on my desk in the order. So that was really helpful for me. But find a way that works for you and just do it, make it work. So to maintain an engaging delivery throughout the speech, be aware of a couple key things: rhetoric, tone, pauses, and pacing, and AGDs, attention getting devices. Let's talk a little bit about rhetoric first. So those of you who haven't taken 10th grade English yet, rhetorical appeals can be broken into 3 main categories: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is representing the credibility of the speaker, establishing status, awareness, professionalism, research. You need to make sure that you are gaining your audience's trust. You do that by being not only with the content you're saying, but also with presenting yourself confidently, with using sources that are established as reputable, by having clear logical flows between everything. Pathos is the persuasion through emotion, commonly anger, excitement, outrage, enthusiasm. And that emotion connects you to your audience. It changes your tone, it changes your pacing, it changes. If you're talking about an atrocity, you're going to have a different tone, one that's more somber than if you're talking about the greatest invention in the world. So just be aware of your tone, pacing, all that kind of stuff. Logos. Logos is your ability to convince your audience of the credibility, well-researchedness, and logical links within your contention, similar to ethos, but ethos is more of like the ethical trust. Logos is more of the content within your speech. So connection between your argument and the audience's belief in that contention. When you're using rhetorical appeals, They can be used in intros, impacts, and the conclusion, as well as throughout the body of it, but they're most common to be there. They can be poetic, related to rhyme, puns, and jokes. You're going to hear, as you go through Congress, a lot of rhetoric. I suggest making a rhetoric bank. So whenever you hear a phrase that really sticks out to you and you're like, oh, that's a good one, I'm going to use that one, write it down, because you should be learning from those that you're working with. You should be not copying anyone's style or anyone's word for word stuff. But if you can make it your own in a way that is going to continue to obtain or maintain the rhetorical appeal of the statement and put your own personal twist on it, fantastic. That's the goal. This is your style and how you stand out for the competition. Make sure that you mix it up. Don't always be serious or funny or have this motion, pacing, tone, monotone, any of that kind of stuff. And make sure that it is matching whatever content you're delivering. Again, different face, different emotion, different pace, different tone for genocide than for immigration policy, environmental policy, economic policy. It's different. Compose yourself in a fitting way. Next, tone, pacing, and pausing. Similar to what I was just talking about, but varying your tone and pacing throughout the speech prevents monotone delivery. So if I were to talk with every word and every syllable like this with a flat face and keep the same tone and pace throughout, which you do hear people do, it's easy to zone out. It's easy to ignore someone who's talking like that. So make sure that you are pausing, collecting attention. Silence really is an effective device that people don't use often enough. If you pause and let whatever it was that you said sink in, it does eat up a lot of time, but also it takes a different pace for the speech and it can be used really effectively. So try to do that if you can. And then also when writing speeches and outlines, plan your tone, pace, volume, and pauses. And there is a difference between being aggressive and assertive. Don't be a bully. Don't use rhetoric or tone, pacing, pausing. That is attacking someone. Be kind. Don't be a butt. This little, laser pointer. Yay, okay. This thing up here, tone on your debate, this is just talking about monotone. So there might be some fluctuation, but there's not really much. And then this is a dynamic voice. So highs, peaks, lows, sharp, blah, 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 blah. That's what you're going for. This, I would honestly write down somewhere, not the monotone, but like everything else, just so that you have a little post-it note saying, these are the options of emotions you can have. A lot of times in debate, and I've noticed that this is especially true for those that come into Congress from PF, sometimes policy, you're used to spreading, you're used to delivering every contention as quickly as you can and doing it not necessarily in a way that's evoking emotion or having a change in tone, but in just getting the content out. Congress, yeah, there's content, but there's also a certain aspect of acting. You are a representative, you are a senator, and you are a human, and you need to make sure that you are using the range of emotions that you possess in order to communicate most effectively to the audience that you are trying to persuade, either to affirm or negate legislation. As far as pacing goes, be aware of your pauses. When you are breathing, exhale. In a lot of my earlier debates, I just didn't exhale ever and would get caught up on my words. And I had a couple judges tell me that it sounded like I was about to cry. I probably was, to be really honest with you. But I also was just trying to get every single word out, and I couldn't do that without breathing, and I was forgetting to breathe, and I would just keep talking, and I would be talking so quickly that people wouldn't be able to understand me, and then I'd have to purposely slow down, and my judges would throw things at me, and it was just like, it's not good. So slow down and breathe, and don't spread. It's not PF or LD. AGDs, attention-getting devices. These go at the beginning of the speech and function to get the attention of the room, and then transition to the legislation and the background of the legislation and the status quo before you present your thesis. They should be referenced once again at the conclusion of your speech for a neat wrap-up or drawback. That's how you make sure that your ending isn't abrupt. And there are multiple approaches, but they should match the tone of your speech. So examples on the right: popular culture, quotes, satirical things, factoids, narratives. If you've heard a round of Congress, you've probably heard a range of AGDs. This is also something you might want to be writing down a bank for, like that rhetoric bank. Maybe you have an intro bank. And that is everything you need to know about speeches. So we went over cycles and overarching debate structure, speech types and positions, basic speech structure, contention structure, flowing the debate, and delivery. As always, I hope that this is helpful, and there are a whole bunch of resources available for your use at howtocongress.com. Have a wonderful day. Bye.